Welcome back, beautiful tri-state area. You're listening to a moment of Zen right here on 710 WOR, the voice of New York, iHeartRadio. I'm your host, Zen Sams. Up next, in just a few minutes, we have the Scandals segment featuring Imran Ansari of Aidala, Bertuna, Kamins, otherwise known as ABK Law, right here in New York City. Imran is a regular contributor and legal analyst on law and crime. Today, we're chatting about the latest development on Bryan Kohberger and the Idaho murders. Now, Bryan Kohberger has been charged with first degree murder and burglary for the killings of four University of Idaho students. Roommates Xana, Kaylee, and Madison, as well as Xana's boyfriend Ethan, were all stabbed to death in the girls' homes on November 13th of 2022. Two other roommates, Bethany and Dylan, survived the attack. Bryan, who just turned 29, was studying for a PhD in criminology at the neighboring Washington State University at the time of the crime. He has a master's degree in criminal justice, interestingly enough, from DeSales University in Pennsylvania. He declined to enter a plea in his arraignment in May. The judge entered a not guilty plea on his behalf on four charges of first degree murder and another on felony burglary. He could face death by firing squad if convicted. Authorities zeroed in on him in part by comparing DNA found at the crime scene with DNA of a relative of Kohberger's, known to be his dad, apparently obtained from the family's home trash. DNA analysis is a revolution in forensics, but like every form of scientific evidence, it has the potential for error. At its best, DNA testing can tell you whose genes were found in a particular location, but it can't tell you how they got there. An innocent person's DNA might be found at a crime scene because they brushed against the victim on the street, used the same doorknob as the perpetrator, or dropped a cigarette butt nearby. Very difficult to pin down. Here to chat Idaho murders and where this case is heading is the amazing Imran Ansari. Welcome back, superstar.
Thanks for having me, Zen. Good to be back.
Okay, my question is, how are they going to put this guy away with no motive nor even a murder weapon at this point?
Zen, it's all going to be relying on forensic evidence. This is a circumstantial case, which is relying on heavily the forensic evidence that was collected both at the scene and then, of course, in Pennsylvania at the family residence of the Kohbergers, which ultimately law enforcement used to link Bryan Kohberger vis-a-vis his DNA with this crime. There's also going to be surveillance camera footage regarding that white car that Kohberger was driving and where the location was of that vehicle in relation to the crime scene. So it's going to be heavily reliant on that forensic evidence. And when you have a case that's reliant for the prosecution on forensic evidence, what does that mean for the defense? That means to attack that forensic evidence, try to get it excluded at the trial. And we know that the defense is doing that right now in motions before the court. And if you're able to do that, then you're able to put on a defense. But the prosecution is going to be saying, no way, we have the forensic evidence. It was properly collected, and it links Bryan Kohberger with these crimes.
Horrific crime. So last year in November, this guy breaks into the house, presumably about a mile from the University of Idaho, and stabs these four students. Then he walks past the stunned surviving roommate and just leaves. And by the time police arrived, Kaylee and Madison, the two 21-year-old best friends, and Ethan and Xana, the two 20-year-olds who were dating, were dead. So early on in the investigation, the Moscow Police Department became interested in that car you mentioned, the white Hyundai Elantra. That surveillance footage does, they did capture near the house that morning. But the big question is, do you think he did it? And is this evidence at hand enough to actually put him away?
So Zen, of course, I'm going to go rely on my lawyerly sort of answer to this question here, right? Of course, there's still allegations, and Bryan Kohberger enjoys the presumption of innocence until it's proven in a court of law that he is guilty of these crimes, or if he pleads guilty to the crimes that he's charged with. Did he do it? Well, that's going to be the prosecution's job to prove before that jury. Of course, the prosecution is alleging that Bryan Kohberger is the murderer and he was behind the horrific slayings of these four college students. And the defense is going to be saying, no, the evidence doesn't lend itself to proof beyond a reasonable doubt that Bryan Kohberger committed these murders. Ultimately, it's the prosecution's job to prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt. But if they're able to link Bryan Kohberger forensically to certain pieces of evidence that are collected at the scene, at Bryan Kohberger's house, the DNA hit that they had, well, then they're going to have a stronger case to put before that jury. Of course, a very emotional case then. You have 4 lives that were lost, and there's a lot of mystery behind this murder. You mentioned the roommates who were surviving, who survived this burglary and the crime committed in that house. And it's very intriguing, mysterious, and tragic all at the same time.
Extremely tragic. I'm going to talk about the party house in just a second, but let's go back to a recent development that was just announced in the media. Idaho District Judge John Judge, who is overseeing the quadruple murder case against Kohberger, granted the defendant's request to remove media cameras from the courtroom. However, he said the proceedings will still be streamed by the court. It is the intense focus on Kohberger and his every move, along with adverse headlines and news articles, that leads the court to conclude that continued photograph and video coverage inside the courtroom by the media should no longer be permitted. Imran, why are they allowing this to be live streamed, and is it customary?
Because the public generally has a right to access to trials, and it is one of the really sacred aspects of our justice system here in the United States, that the public has a right to be present at a trial, has a right to be present and see and hear the testimony and evidence in a trial, like a criminal trial like this, or a civil trial, what have you. There are, of course, certain circumstances where a judge will close the courtroom to protect, say, like the identity of a minor who may be testifying about abuse or something like that. But generally, there's a right to access for the public. So what the judge is doing here in his discretion as a judge is balancing Bryan Kohberger's right to a fair trial and also the access of the public to be able to see what is going on in this trial. And in his discretion, in his determination, he found that having, say, private media companies and outlets with their cameras in the courtroom would be disruptive. It would be focused primarily on Bryan Kohberger rather than the court in general. So now he has decided that the public's going to be able to see what's going on with this trial. They'll be able to hear the evidence, see the evidence, hear the testimony, but they're going to do it via this live stream, which is controlled by the court rather than, say, a slew of cameras for the media.
There you go. The bottom line is they want to control the narrative, and they want to keep this contained, and they don't want this to turn into a media frenzy, which I totally agree with. So Imran, Kohberger is accused of prowling around the home at least 12 times before November 13th of last year. It still doesn't answer the question of how he knew these girls, and that's the big mystery. So theoretically, Bryan could use the party house status of this grisly murder scene to explain why his DNA was found there. And one of the most important parts of this case is that DNA. And what we know is that this was a party house. We know that there were hundreds of kids in this house, and it could have even included him. And the thing is, if he was in this house, do we assume that these 4 students knew everybody who'd been there? I doubt that. Now, all of a sudden, you might have a completely different trial. What do you say to this?
Yeah, and that would be a point that the defense would want to try to argue to the jury, is that there was a lot of people coming in and out of this house. And again, it goes to the forensic aspect. If they're able to attack the forensic evidence linking Bryan Kohberger to the crime scene, well, then the prosecution's case is going to become weaker and weaker. And if they're able to give a plausible explanation, of course, the defendant enjoys the right to remain silent even in the courtroom. They don't have to prove anything, right? But if they're able to put out a narrative to that jury, meaning the defense team, that, you know, the reason why Bryan Kohberger's DNA or what have you may be at the location was because there were parties there, and maybe Bryan Kohberger went to the party. I mean, there's a lot of scenarios that you can put out there, but that would be the benefit of the defense if they're able to get that across to the jury. And the prosecution knows that, and they're going to have to really put their case together in a way which proves their case beyond a reasonable doubt to that jury. And they're going to have to really anticipate all those attacks by the defense about the party house aspect, about, the fact that trace DNA could have been brought in there by some other means. And I'm sure the prosecution is getting ready to answer those sort of rebuttal arguments as we speak, as they prepare their case.
Ugh, this is gonna be so tough. I could see it play out right now. Now, the knife sheath, which was later found to have Kohberger's DNA on it, was found by police alongside the bodies of Kaylee and Madison and Xana and Ethan. And Kohberger's defense team could use the victim's inability to keep tabs on who's who to plant the theory that Brian's DNA was, to your point, brought into that home before that quadruple murder. I mean, there's a neighbor, Jeremy Regan. He confirmed to Court TV, which you are very familiar with, that there were constantly people in and out of the home. He said hundreds. So the question is, how do you tie him to the murder at this point, right? So it becomes complicated, right?
Yeah, all that forensic evidence, then it's obviously going to be the testimony of law enforcement, the testimony of witnesses who were, at the parties or at around the scene, to sort of give some narrative and support to the prosecution's version of events. But really, it's a circumstantial case. No one saw Bryan Kohberger in that house. No one saw Bryan Kohberger with the knife in his hand. When you have a circumstantial case like that, prosecution is going to be relying again on the forensic evidence, and it's like it's connecting the dots of a puzzle. Then, if they're able to connect all the dots and really make out their case before that jury, then they have a good chance of getting a conviction. If there is even a scintilla, a sliver of reasonable doubt that the defense is going to argue, then you know what? The jury has to say not guilty, because any reasonable doubt is enough to get an acquittal at trial.
The thought that this guy can even the thought I can't even fathom the thought that he could get off, but, technicalities are technicalities. Now, the footprint found inside the home could obviously help police build their case beyond the initial probable cause affidavit, because however, I don't know, I mean, its value may depend on what else detectives find with a series of these search warrants following this arrest, but, it's more than 2,500 miles from the crime scene. I mean, there's a lot of territory to cover there. So, I mean, in a probable cause affidavit released, investigators revealed that that shoe print found at the crime scene had a sole pattern that resembled that of a Vans sneaker. How
Right.
important is this shoe print?
Again, it's one piece of the puzzle, and if they're able to use that shoe print and that evidence to again add to that argument and to their sort of ammo box of evidence against Bryan Kohberger, that there's a match there, and Bryan Kohberger had a Vans sneaker like that, same size, same treading, and all that. If they're able to really convince the jury that that was also a piece of evidence that you can link Bryan Kohberger to these murders, and couple that with the DNA evidence, couple that with all the other evidence regarding his vehicle, then again, prosecution has a stronger case. Whereas if the defense are able to say, really, Vans sneakers, how many Vans sneakers are being sold in the United States on a given day, even, and this doesn't conclusively mean anything that Bryan Kohberger was there and there's a match. These are going to be the competing arguments, and based on the evidence coming into court, and ultimately, at the end of the day, it's going to be the jury's hard decision to evaluate that evidence, deliberate amongst themselves, and render their verdict.
This is a tough one, Imran. This is a tough one. What are your final predictions?
So, I mean, we're looking at a trial later this year. Well, I would say 2024, Zen. Most likely fall. It could still get postponed if there's more arguments or motions made attacking the evidence by the defense. But we're all going to have our eyes on that courtroom, and whether the prosecution has enough evidence circumstantially and forensically to get a conviction. It does, at the end of the day, 4 lives were lost, young lives were lost, really tragic case. And I think when you have a tragedy like that, you have all eyes on the courtroom, and you want to have a determination which is just and fair. So we'll see how the prosecution can put their case together. And of course, keep our eyes on what arguments the defense are going to be making on behalf of Bryan Kohberger.
Thank you so much. Well said, my friend. It's always a pleasure having you on. Your insight is invaluable, and I love chatting with you. You lay it out so nicely. Play devil's advocate when you're supposed to, and you don't when you don't. Thank you so much for coming on.
All right. Thank you, Zen. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Kohberger faces 4 counts of first-degree murder and a felony burglary charge for allegedly entering the house with the intent to kill, and authorities have not publicly disclosed a potential motive as of yet. That was our scandals segment, and that was the incredible Imran Ansari. You could check him out directly on the gram at Imran Ansari ESQ, or you could head directly to their website at aidalalaw.com. You're listening to A Moment of Zen right here on 710 WOR, the voice of New York iHeartRadio. We'll be right back after this.